Okay, so you're here because you really like to get into the nitty-gritty, right? To dive deep into topics without feeling like you're in over your head. You want the good stuff, and you want it to stick.
Yeah, you want to cut through the noise.
Exactly. And today, on the deep dive, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to break down something that's incredibly important to how we learn and how we understand the world.
Something fundamental.
Yeah, and that is critical analytic thinking.
Critical analytic thinking, or CAT for short, is like the engine of true learning. It's how we move beyond just taking in facts to really understanding and using them.
Right, so it's not just about being smart, it's about using your smarts effectively.
Exactly. And today, we're going to take a deep dive into what CAT actually means in education today. We'll be drawing on research, especially this really fascinating article called Assessment of Critical Analytic Thinking. It really gets to the heart of how this concept works in the real world.
So today's mission is to give you a crystal clear picture of CCAT. We'll explore why it's so important for you as a learner, how it shows up in all those national standards you hear about like NAEP, Common Core, and NGSS.
Those big, important frameworks that guide a lot of education.
Right. We'll also look at the challenges in figuring out just how good someone is at C and why we need better ways to assess those skills, especially something called formative assessment.
And, this is about more than just teachers and schools. Understanding how CP is seen and measured gives anyone a powerful tool to look at information, to make smart choices in your own life, no matter what you're doing.
Right. Whether you're reading a news article, making a decision at work, or just trying to understand a complex issue, these skills are essential.
They truly are.
Okay, so let's jump right in with the million-dollar question. What is critical analytic thinking? We hear critical thinking all the time, but what does it actually mean when you're trying to learn or solve a problem?
That's a great starting point. The idea of promoting critical thinking has been around in education forever, but there hasn't always been a super clear agreement on what it looks like in practice.
Like, how do you know if you're doing it right?
Exactly. Our understanding of CT, based on the research we're looking at, is that it's really two sides of the same coin.
Okay, interesting. What are those two sides?
Well, on one side, it involves how you approach things like a certain mindset. It's a willingness to question, to explore, to not just accept things at face value.
Like being skeptical, but in a constructive way.
Exactly. And the other side is the actual mental processes you use to analyze information. Both of these sides are shaped by how you interact with the world and the specific stuff you're learning about. It's not just about thinking hard, it's about thinking smart.
Right, so context matters.
Yeah.
So what does this questioning analytical approach look like when you're faced with something new?
Well, a big part of it is being comfortable with uncertainty. Being okay with the idea that there might not be just one right answer or one perfect solution. You have to be open to multiple possibilities.
So embracing the gray areas instead of always looking for black and white.
Exactly. And it involves a natural curiosity, a real urge to dig deeper into complex information. You don't just stop at the surface. You want to understand the why behind things, the nuances.
So it's like being that kid who keeps asking why until they get a satisfying answer.
Yeah. And the mental process part is how you connect different pieces of information and judge their value. It's about weighing evidence to figure out which solutions are most likely to be true or effective.
Like piecing together a puzzle, but maybe with some pieces missing and some that don't quite fit.
That's a great analogy. Now, here's something really interesting. While we can think about CCAT in terms of steps and strategies, it's also super connected to what you're actually analyzing.
Like you can't analyze a poem the same way you analyze a scientific experiment, right?
Exactly. You need some background knowledge. You need to understand the rules or expectations of that specific area. And you need those analytical skills all working together.
It's like, Kyoko, you can't dissect a car engine if you've never even seen one before.
Exactly. So while general critical thinking skills are important, applying them effectively requires understanding the specific context.
Okay, so you can't just be a good critical thinker in general. You need to know your stuff in the specific area you're thinking about. Now, this brings up another question. What about taking those analytical skills you develop in one area and applying them to something totally different? Like, if I become a really sharp critical thinker in my job, does that automatically make me great at evaluating news articles or political arguments?
That's a crucial question, and it's something researchers debate a lot. The evidence suggests that transferring THEAT skills from one area to another isn't as simple as we might hope.
So just because I'm a critical thinking rock star at work doesn't mean I can automatically analyze a complex social issue with the same level of skill.
Right. It's harder than it seems. The more different the two areas are, the harder it is to transfer those skills.
Okay, that makes sense. Analyzing data for a marketing campaign feels pretty different from trying to understand the nuances of climate change science.
Exactly. So, how do we actually help ourselves and others develop this SECAT capacity? Well, it's a gradual process. It builds on your overall development, the knowledge you gain, even the mistakes you make and learn from.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And even from a young age, we have the potential to develop those self-regulation skills.
Hmm.
That ability to manage your own thinking, which is super helpful for SECAT.
Like being able to step back and say, okay, am I approaching this problem in the right way? What assumptions am I making?
Exactly. But not everyone gets the same opportunities to develop these skills.
Right. The research pointed out that some people might be at a disadvantage here. Can you talk about that?
Many individuals, especially those in more challenging educational environments, may not receive explicit instruction in how to think critically. They might not get the chance to really wrestle with those tough, thought-provoking tasks that help you build both the questioning mindset and the specific analytical skills.
So it's not just about having a natural ability to think critically. It's also about getting the right kind of support and opportunities to practice those skills.
Exactly. And this is a big deal because CIACAT has such broad benefits, not just for school, but for being an engaged citizen, for succeeding in your career, for just navigating life in a complex world.
Like a superpower that can help you in every aspect of your life.
It truly is. And unfortunately, some past efforts to improve education haven't fully grasped this. They haven't given everyone the same chances to develop these skills.
And that's part of the reason we're seeing this big push for CIAT in current standards like the Common Core and the next generation science standards, right? The idea is to prepare people better for college and their careers, because there's a sense that many students aren't quite ready when they finish high school.
That's exactly right. Those standards aim to address that gap. They recognize that CIAT is essential for you and future generations.
Okay, so we've got a better grasp of what CIAT is and why it's so important. Now let's see how this plays out on those big national education guidelines. Let's start with the NAAEP framework for reading. What does that tell us about the role of C in understanding what you read?
So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, think of it like a national checkup on how students are doing in various subjects. It has this reading framework that views reading as a very active process. It's not just decoding words on a page, it's about constructing meaning, interpreting it, and then actually using that meaning.
So it's moved beyond just basic reading comprehension, like understanding the plot of a story or the main facts in an article.
Exactly. Comprehension is now seen as a midpoint for you, not the end goal. The NAEP framework outlines 3 cognitive targets, or levels of thinking involved in reading. There's locate and recall, which is about finding information in the text.
Like remembering specific details.
Right. Then there's integrate and interpret. This is where you start putting those pieces together, drawing connections, understanding what the text means.
Okay, so that's where we start getting into deeper thinking.
Exactly. And then the third level is critique and evaluate. That's where Celity really comes in. This is where you're analyzing the text, judging its credibility, thinking about the author's intentions.
So you're not just a passive reader anymore. You're actively engaging with the text, thinking about its strengths and weaknesses, forming your own opinions about it.
Exactly. And those last 2 levels, integrate and interpret and critique and evaluate, are central to how NAEP views CAT in reading.
Can you give an example of what kind of activities would require those CTEP-related skills when you're reading?
Sure. Imagine you're reading a historical speech. Analyzing how the speaker used certain words to evoke emotions in the audience, that would require CIAT. Or maybe you're reading several articles on a controversial topic. Synthesizing those different perspectives to form a balanced understanding, that's also using CIAT.
So it's about moving beyond just understanding what the text says to really thinking about how it says it and why the author might have chosen those specific words or that particular structure.
Exactly. And the NAEP framework stresses that assessments need to capture how well students are developing those CIAT strategies.
But the research also mentioned this worry about a persistent achievement gap on NAEP reading scores, and the concern that these new, higher standards might actually widen that gap.
That's a really important point. The concern is that if teaching doesn't focus on both the foundational skills and critical analytic thinking, then those students who are already behind in basic reading might fall even further behind.
That makes sense. If you're still struggling to decode words and understand basic sentence structure, it's going to be even harder to engage in those higher level analytical tasks.
Right. especially when these new standards, like the Common Core, often assume a certain level of basic reading comprehension as a starting point.
It's like asking someone to run a marathon when they're still learning to walk. So how does the Common Core try to address CAT in English language arts?
The Common Core weaves CT throughout its expectations. Take a look at a second grade standard. It asks students to explain how specific images, like a diagram showing how a machine works, contribute to and clarify a text. Now, that might sound simple, but there's a lot going on there.
Right, it sounds deceptively simple. Break it down for us. What does a student actually need to be able to do to meet that standard?
First, they need those fundamental reading skills. They need to know their letters, sound out words, understand vocabulary, get the main idea.
Basics.
Exactly. Then they have to look at the image and understand it. Then compare the information from the text and the image.
Okay, so they're starting to make connections, see how those two sources of information relate to each other.
Right. And then they need to analyze how each source helps them understand the topic and how they work together. And finally, explain that relationship either in writing or by speaking.
Wow, that's a lot of layers of thinking for a second grader.
It is. And throughout this, they need to be thinking about their own understanding, what's clear, what's confusing. That's what we call metacognition, thinking about your own thinking.
Being aware of your own learning process.
Exactly. And these standards are then tested through those large-scale assessments like SBAC and PRACC.
The big standardized tests everyone gets nervous about.
Right. But those are summative assessments. They're designed to see what a student has learned at the end of a period of instruction. What's really needed, though, is ongoing feedback throughout the learning process. That's where formative assessment comes in. It helps you and your teachers track your progress, see where you need more support, and adjust the learning along the way.
It's like checking your map regularly on a road trip to make sure you're still headed in the right direction.
Exactly. And like the NAAP framework, the Common Core standards assume that students have already built a basic understanding of the text before they even start engaging in the higher level CCA.
Which again, highlights the challenge for students who haven't yet reached that basic reading level, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's hard to build a house if you don't have a solid foundation.
Exactly. The Common Core sets high expectations for CA, which is great, but without the right support to ensure everyone has that foundational comprehension, we risk widening the achievement gap.
It's like giving everyone the same blueprint for a complex machine without making sure they all have the same basic tools and materials. Some people will be able to build it, and others will be left behind. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about science. How does the Next Generation Science Standards, or NGSS, approach critical analytic thinking in science education?
The NGSS puts CAA front and center. They see it as completely inseparable from the actual practice of science itself.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and formulas.
Not at all. Think about what scientists actually do. They constantly observe, experiment, analyze data, and form conclusions. They question their own ideas, consider alternative explanations, and refine their understanding based on evidence.
It's a dynamic, ongoing process.
Exactly. And those activities, arguing from evidence, critiquing the work of others, analyzing data, those are core to both doing science and learning science, according to NGSS. And in a major shift from previous science standards, the NGSS doesn't treat C as some separate skill you learn in an inquiry unit. It's woven directly into what they call performance expectations, or PEs.
Okay, so these performance expectations are kind of like learning goals,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Statements of what students should know and be able to do.
Right. Each PE combines three things: a core idea from a science discipline, a cross-cutting concept that connects different areas of science, and a scientific or engineering practice.
So it's not just about what you know, but also how you apply that knowledge.
Precisely. And CCAT is a key part of those practices. In fact, about a third of the NGSS standards have an explicit expectation for students to use CCAT.
Can you give me an example of a high school performance expectation that involves CCAT?
Sure. One example asks students to evaluate the evidence supporting claims that changes in environmental conditions may lead to increases in some species, the emergence of new species over time, and the extinction of others.
Wow, so they're not just learning about ecosystems. They're actually using critical thinking skills to analyze real-world problems.
Exactly. And the NGSS emphasizes this at all grade levels. So whether it's NAEP in reading, Common Core in English language arts, or NGSS in science, there's this clear expectation. You need to be able to analyze complex info and make evidence-based arguments in real-world contexts.
It's really about equipping students with the thinking skills they need to be successful in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
But as you said, there are some challenges in figuring out just how well students are developing these skills. How do we assess critical analytic thinking effectively?
That's the million-dollar question. Assessment, especially for something as complex as C-key, is really tricky. It's not just about giving a test and getting a score. We need a principled, thoughtful design approach.
Like a blueprint for building a strong assessment.
Yes. That blueprint involves having a clear model of the cognitive skills being assessed, designing tasks that actually elicit those skills, and having valid ways to interpret the results. The whole assessment process is a cycle. We observe someone's performance, we score it, we summarize those scores, and then we interpret what those scores tell us about their C-type abilities.
And each of those steps is influenced by specific parts of the assessment itself.
Exactly. The actual questions or tasks we give, the scoring guides or rubrics we use, and even our overall understanding of what CT is and how it works.
Right. If the foundation is shaky, the whole structure is going to be weak.
Exactly. While large-scale assessments are generally good at the measurement model part, the statistical stuff.
Making sure the scores are reliable and valid.
Right. But when it comes to SAC, the challenges lie in the assessment tasks themselves, the rubrics we use to score them, and how we even define and understand the very thing we're trying to measure.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. Let's start with assessment items, the actual tasks or questions we give to assess CSAC. What are some of the difficulties in designing those effectively?
One key thing to remember is that CHAS skills are very context-specific. It's not realistic to think they'll just develop no matter what kind of problems you're working on, or that they'll easily transfer to completely different areas.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of skill.
Exactly. So assessments and even teaching need to use tasks and scenarios that are meaningful and relevant.
Authentic to the domain you're working in. Like, thinking like a historian is different from thinking like a scientist.
Precisely. And the research mentions document-based questions, or DBQs, as a good example of assessments that try to do this in history.
DBQs are those assessments where students are given primary source documents, like historical letters or speeches, and asked to analyze them. Right.
Yes. They require students to analyze the sources, think about their reliability, and piece together information to form an understanding of the historical context.
It's like being a historical detective.
It really is. And PAR-CC, the assessment aligned with Common Core, has also tried to move in this direction with their research simulation tasks, or RSTs.
But the article gave a couple of contrasting examples of PAR-CC RSTs. One about Amelia Earhart and one about letters between John and Abigail Adams. What was the difference there?
The Amelia Earhart task, while interesting, really focused on her bravery. It didn't really require students to engage in deep historical analysis. It wasn't quite a question worth answering from a historical thinking perspective. The John and Abigail Adams task, though, presented their letters with differing views on freedom and independence. Students were asked to analyze those views and construct their own argument.
So it required them to grapple with complex ideas and conflicting perspectives, which is more in line with what historians actually do.
Exactly. And what about science? How does NGSS tackle this?
Yeah, how do they design assessments that get at those critical thinking skills in science?
Well, NGSS assessments are still being developed, but the standards themselves are designed with authentic contexts and tasks in mind. The performance expectations are written in a way that they can be assessed, and they often include additional guidance to help develop those specific tasks.
So the focus is on assessing what scientists actually do, not just on memorizing facts and formulas.
Right. And because CATAT often involves thinking through complex, real-world problems, these tasks often need to be performance-based. Think extended responses or projects where you really have to demonstrate your understanding and skills in a deeper way.
Okay, so it's not just about multiple choice questions or short answers. It's about showing you can apply your knowledge and thinking skills to real-world problems.
Exactly. And while these performance assessments can be harder to develop and score, we are seeing more and more of them.
Which makes sense given the emphasis on real-world skills.
Right. So better assessment tasks are key, but then we also need to think about how we score those tasks. That brings us to the second challenge, CCAT assessment rubrics. How do we evaluate student responses to these complex tasks?
Yeah, how do we make sure the scoring is fair, consistent, and actually tells us something meaningful about a student's CHAT abilities?
Well, a common approach is to start with the description of the highest achievement level, the ideal response.
Like what a perfect score would look like.
Exactly. And then for the lower levels, they just add more and more negative adjectives like accurate analysis, mostly accurate, somewhat accurate, and so on. The PIRCC rubric is a good example of this.
But that seems kind of vague, doesn't it? What does mostly accurate really mean?
That's the problem. These subjective adjectives are difficult to interpret consistently, even with training. But the bigger issue is that they don't give useful feedback. If you get a score that says your analysis was minimally accurate, what does that actually tell you about what to improve?
It doesn't really pinpoint the specific skills you need to work on.
Exactly. So, what would a better rubric look like? One that's actually helpful for learning.
Yeah, what would a rubric that actually supports student learning look like?
Well, a better rubric would have clearer levels with specific meanings tied to the skills being assessed. Like the San Diego Striving Raiders project has this rubric that focuses on the different tactics students use when they're analyzing text. For example, if you're trying to identify the main idea, there might be tactics like looking for repeated words or identifying the topic sentence. The rubric then describes student responses based on how many of these tactics they used correctly and how well they connected their analysis.
So instead of just saying the analysis was better or worse, it actually points out the specific analytical moves the student made.
Exactly. These more objective rubrics are easier to use consistently, and more importantly, they give more helpful feedback. They tell teachers and students what they did well and what specific skills they need to develop.
So, better assessment tasks, better rubrics. What's the third challenge?
Ah, yes. The third challenge is what the research calls SAT assessment construct formulations. Sounds a bit jargony, but it's really important.
Okay, demystify it for us. What exactly are construct formulations?
Basically, it's our mental model of the thinking processes involved in STAT, how we believe someone goes about solving an assessment task. It connects the task, the scoring, and what we can actually say about someone's SAT abilities.
So it's like the underlying theory of how HAT works, which then informs how we design the assessments and interpret the results.
Exactly. Without a clear construct formulation, the scores from an assessment are just numbers. They don't really tell us anything meaningful about someone's ability to think critically.
Okay, so how are these construct formulations usually done, and what are the limitations of that approach?
Often it's a top-down approach. We start by describing expert performance, often based on grade-level standards.
Okay, so we start with the ideal. What does a perfect score look like?
Right. And then we define lower performance levels as just less successful attempts at that same task. For example, the Common Core reading standards, where each grade level's expectation for citing textual evidence just asks for more or stronger evidence.
So it tells you what the goal is, but not really how to get there.
Exactly. Knowing that a student might cite weak or irrelevant evidence doesn't really tell the teacher what to do about it. It doesn't provide a roadmap for learning. What we really need are bottom-up formulations.
Bottom up. So starting from the ground level, from the very beginning stages of learning a skill.
Right. We need to outline those intermediate steps, those building blocks of learning.
So instead of just focusing on how someone might fail, we focus on the steps involved in learning and mastering a skill.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of learning progressions comes in. The science education community has been doing some really interesting work on this. The NGSS, for example, organizes its standards around these learning progressions. They show how different aspects of scientific practice, including set stencils, are introduced and then become more complex over time.
So it's not just about getting better or worse at the same skill. It's about developing qualitatively different aspects of that skill as you learn.
That's exactly right. And these learning progressions provide a much better foundation for designing assessments that can really guide instruction and learning.
That's like a roadmap for learning.
It is. Okay, all this leads us to the final and perhaps most important point, the need for formative assessment in assessing CTAT.
Right. Why is this so crucial for learners?
We need assessments that don't just measure your abilities, but also give you meaningful feedback to guide your learning.
Assessments that help you grow.
Yes, that's crucial for reaching those high standards we've been talking about, and for making sure everyone has the chance to succeed. In reading, for instance, we need formative assessment to first check if students even understand the text literally before we assess their analytical skills.
Right. It's pointless to ask someone to analyze a text if they're still struggling to understand what the words mean.
Exactly. Formative assessment can help teachers understand students' specific strengths and weaknesses across the different parts of a CCASC.
So meeting students where they are and helping them take those next steps.
Precisely. Effective teachers are constantly doing this. They're observing, adjusting, providing support, and formative assessment should be at the heart of that.
It's about making assessment a tool for learning, not just for measuring.
Exactly. Sadly, many current CX assessments don't provide that kind of useful feedback. And many teachers lack the support they need to implement effective formative assessment practices. This is where we need to focus our efforts. We need to rethink assessment design and provide teachers with the training and resources they need to help students develop these essential skills.
So to sum it all up, we've explored what critical analytic thinking is, how it's emphasized in those national education standards, and the challenges we face in truly understanding how well students are developing these skills. The key takeaway is this. We need to move towards assessments that not only measure, but also guide learning. Assessments that help everyone reach their full potential.
I completely agree. And as we said at the beginning, this isn't just for teachers and students. Understanding CI and how we assess it is valuable for anyone who wants to be a more critical and informed thinker.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. What if we all had a clear picture of our own CIAT development, our strengths and areas for growth, and knew exactly what steps to take to keep improving?
That's a powerful idea.
What would that do for our education system, for our workplaces, for our ability to engage in thoughtful discussions and make informed decisions about the complex issues facing our world?
It's something worth thinking about.
It certainly is. And that's a wrap for today's deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of critical analytic thinking as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
And keep thinking critically out there.